tonight's gathering was to kind of reflect on what it means for Ho-Chunk people to still be here 190 years later after that, and just overall about Ho-Chunk heritage in Wisconsin in general. And so we're very honored to have Michelle Greendeer-Rave here to talk to us tonight. And so normally I don't just read bios, but you're involved in so many things. I'll just read it. So Michelle Greendeer-Rave is the wife of a disabled veteran, and a mom to 5 children, and foster mom to many. She's an enthusiastic historian who has worked at the Ho-Chunk Nation since 1998 as an in-house tribal attorney. She specialized in treaties, housing, real estate, probate, elder protection, litigation, and gaming. She is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Wisconsin Law School, and is a small business owner of an equine sports and boarding facility in Black River Falls, known as Sweetgrass Stables. Presently sits on the local Jackson County board, on the local Black River Falls Memorial Hospital board, on a low-income housing nonprofit community action agency known as Western Dairyland. She also volunteers her time to assist the disabled, veterans in need, and educational programming of agribusiness and history. Volunteered with startup nonprofits for local tribally based Montessori daycare and academy, and volunteered with the creation of a local new Crime Stoppers of Jackson County. Presently specializing in Indian gaming and elder protection and related disability rights, Michelle provides aid assisting elders in needs such as DV issues, financial exploitation, will making, VA disability, probate, and disability rights. She previously served 1 full term on Western's board and currently serving another board term. Excited to return to Jackson County Board Office to help with social service programming, law enforcement enhancement, homeless planning. And we're so glad you took time out of your schedule to be here tonight to help us reflect on this history. So.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. When Josie called me, I said an enthusiastic yes right away because for many reasons. Not because I like to talk. We'll start there. And not because I like to put people asleep, because that's what lawyers do. But it was because we learn so much from history. And we're facing a time that I never could have imagined, where our history is wanting to be erased by our communities. And I wonder, how will we learn from our past if we're covering it up? So before I proceed with my speech, I'm going to ask a question to each of you. When you were growing up, did you learn any Indian history at all where you went to school? So I thought this would be a good opening exercise, because look at all the various ages everyone in this room spans, and probably all the different geographical locations you come from. But the one thing we all have in common is we all have been barely taught anything. Even if you grew up and lived in Wisconsin, a native of Wisconsin, not Native American, but native of Wisconsin, you still were deprived of the very history of the roads you drive and the routes and the rivers. But one thing didn't escape history, and that was the name of most of our cities and our lakes in Wisconsin. Now, they did change Madison. It used to be called Dejope. I used to hold the original maps down at the Historical Society in my hand. Everything said Dejope. And then one day, someone said, we'll call it Madison. And all of those maps are scratched out, and they say Madison. And the lake areas all along the outside of the lake. So in the wave of a pen, the action of a pen, history changes. Why am I talking about this now? Because, as Adam said, on this day, 190 years ago, it was a pen that froze that history. At least the history of the surviving families of 200 years of absolute chaos happening in Wisconsin. And when I say absolute chaos, I want you to think of Sarajevo. I want you to think of Grenada. I want you to think of Panama or the Philippines or even now with Russia. Think of chaos happening for 200 years and right up until probably the 1880s. And we're talking about an unstable government in Wisconsin. So I wanted to kind of use that as our foundation. Now, it's really easy for me to just talk about history and just recite portions of history and highlights of history. And I don't want to bore you with that because there's something so much more to sharing your knowledge with others than just reading the dates off, because things are happening all along the way. So what was happening? Well, a couple of the books that I recently looked through and really enjoyed thumbing through were through the eyes of a woman. And I didn't even realize it until I was like 3 chapters in, and Kizzy's wife is talking about how beautiful all these young, half French, half native people are. And she went from half French, half Chippewa, half French, half Winnebago, half French, half Potawatomi, half French, half Menominee. And I was like, what kind of man, not even really paying attention, is going to talk about the beauty of somebody? And she was talking about the beauty of men, of women, of elders, of children. And I was like, wow, I don't think I've ever read that in any sort of historical line of books. So that really tipped me off to, hey, I'm gonna get something here that I've never received. And that was a little bit of a taste of the times through the eyes of a woman. So what happens with history are a couple of things. The first thing that we have to talk about is Wisconsin is still considered uncharted territory, right? So in 1634, you all know this from your history book, I know that, right? This famous French explorer lands on the shores of Green Bay, Mogashooch, the Red Banks, the sacred land of the Ho-Chunk, the land where we came, the sacred land of our creation, where we came out of the earth and walked the earth. That's how sacred it is. It is our paradise. How many of you have been to Door County? If you've never been to Door County, you really should take some time and go. If you look at Wisconsin, Door County's the finger, right? The thumb. And it is literally our paradise. So you have the Niagara Escarpment, you have the wind thermals, you have white oaks grown in very harsh conditions, so they're very concentrated, very, very strong pieces of wood that are hard to cut through. And it is surrounded by blue water on one side, the lake, right? And then kind of green marshy water on the bay side of the Green Bay. Hence the name Winnebago, right? People of the stinky water. First question I always get is, why do you call yourselves Ho-Chunk? And in an act of self-determination, we decided, why would we call ourselves kind of a derogatory name that other tribes called us? I mean, if your name was Stinky, would you want to say, my name is Stinky, I hail from the land of Stinky? No, you wouldn't. You would want to say who you self-identify with. The people of the strong voice. Or the fish eaters. There are a couple of variations of why we're called the Ho-Chunk. So in that act of self-determination, I'm going to use Ho-Chunk instead of Winnebago. For no other reason than I think that name's kind of snotty, and I do not want to disrespect the action of my predecessors and our tribal leaders to restore our dignity in calling ourselves what we've always called ourselves for centuries. We were building an economy without even realizing it when John Nicolay landed. So he lands on the shores of Green Bay, and he thinks he found what country? Do you remember this?
India?
Yes. He thought he found a trade route to India/China. He really was lost. So he gets out of his, they have a boat, a ship. He gets out of the canoe that comes up, and he has on all this kind of like silken Asian garb of sorts. He takes 2 guns. And he holds it up in the sky, and he blasts them off. right? And he declares the land to be owned by the French. Out of the woods come our ancestors. And having never seen a white man and having never seen guns, to our ancestors, he appeared godlike. And that was our first, I guess, documented contact that we have. Now, those early documents, those manuscripts are all written in French. So if we want to do research, we'd have to have those translated. I don't know if you've ever heard of Dr. Nancy Lurie. I worked with her for the past, I want to say 20 years before she passed away. And she would vehemently argue with me that the Ho-Chunk people, based on these French manuscripts from the 1600s, we were not a paternalistic. She said we were maternalistic. It's a matriarchy. So her and I, we would just go these rounds and we'd look for more history with Anna Ray Funmaker. And we never found the answer. So I guess it'll always be a mystery. But all of this is leading up to this very poignant date and time that Adam has etched for us to focus on, and that is 1832. So I'm going to go back to where I was talking about Wisconsin was a chaotic time. How many of you have seen that movie, The Revenant? I think Leonardo DiCaprio was in it. Okay. So we always hear about the fur trade, right, growing up. This is one of the earlier economies that had occurred with not just the French, but some of the Canadian tribes and the early English explorers coming through. And in this vein of thought, I always romanticized that the fur trade was just kind of like real relaxing, kind of like when you go to Heritage Hill in Green Bay or any kind of frontier land. And you read about these wars and these fights over these pelts and this trade and these trade routes and these territories by the tribes. And you see the movie Revenant and you're like, wait a second, there was nothing romantic, nothing peaceful about this movement at all. And that was the first probably 150 years of Wisconsin was this war, this trade war. And so when you plant that kind of in your mind, you realize then from 1634 to 1832, right? So 98 years now is where I'm going to try to focus on of what happened then. And I did make a timeline. And I have a timeline only because when you're trained as a lawyer, you feel like you need to validate everything you say. So, and I'm gonna back this with, I think it's because sometimes when I'm native and I teach our history, there's usually a heckler in the crowd that says, that didn't happen. No, that couldn't have been. And then I always have to say, yes, I have the site here. Why don't you Google it right now? So I kind of come in a little bit over-prepared. And I think it's because when I talk about our people, I like to dress with what our people wore. I like to present to the people I'm hoping to educate that there's more to this than just these books or just these pictures, that there's real live people whose history is embedded in my DNA. Everyone's DNA has a history, but there's a history that I'm going to try to share, and I'm extrapolating everything I can to give that to you. So that's why I kind of do that. So as a lawyer, I still have this urge, and it's the training probably, to always just go back and do a little bit of a citation. So let me just pull, and this is going to be interesting because it's going to be your small snippet, and I promise you it's probably the only time I'm going to pull this up, is a treaty timeline of what kind of happened. And I pulled it up here earlier before we started, but it appears to have disappeared. So let me just pull it. Aha, here it is. Okay. So now we start with the 1634. That's the best that I can come up with right now because we didn't document our history. We didn't, but we had a written language, but we didn't document it. So from 1634 to the 1700s, you're going to begin to see the massive influx of missionaries coming into Wisconsin. And the influx was to convert the Indians to Christianity. For example, there was an individual by the name of Father Rene Menard. That his only goal, while at the same time to become an economist and engage in the fur trade, was he explored Wisconsin and would gather as many furs as he could and return to Montreal with news of the abundancy of furs in Wisconsin. So these stories are going all over, especially up north. And the French are beginning to realize that the lucrative fur trade market is beginning to really grow, and they want to control the business. And these are, now I'm going to be jumping through 200 or 98 years for sure, and then 200 years. So from 1650 to 1850, and so we're going beyond the 1832 mark, Wisconsin's entire economy revolves around the fur trade. It's the same way our economy is now revolving around oil. The demand for beaver pelts was so great, it was unimaginable, and that demand lasted for a period of 200 years. From 1755 and 1763, the English and the French are battling to control the fur trade in Wisconsin. In 1803, we had something major happen to our historical timeline. That was the purchase known as the Louisiana Purchase. That included 828,000 square miles of territory from France, doubling the size of the Republic. 15 states were eventually created from that deal alone. We called it the massive land grab. In 1816, there was a first treaty. I would call it a pre-treaty, though. I don't think it was really truly a treaty, because in order to have a treaty that's effective or properly executed, you need parties of governments to sign. And this one was interesting because this treaty of friendship was government, in a sense, tribes, but we didn't have formal governments. We had our traditional form of government. And that was, we had our traditional chiefs who controlled the activities of each village or clan. But when people think we'd send our chief to a treaty signing, it usually wasn't a chief, just so you know. It was the way our clans are structured. The chief, who was usually the Sky clan, would send someone from the Earth clans, the Bear clan or the Deer clan, to execute anything dealing with land. So there was always this confusion because they said, oh, you sent this chief. Well, it wasn't a chief. It was just a young, maybe messenger or translator to get the information and come back. But while they were there, they were said, hey, can you mark this piece of paper? They didn't understand English. Some may have a little bit. They couldn't read, barely any. But then once they etched that X, which you're going to see on our old treaties, that in the eyes of the American government, that was not even, it was still developing, and the territorial government of Wisconsin, that they considered something valid. So I always tell people that because they say, oh, well, the chiefs all signed that. I'm like, it wasn't even the chief. It was like sending out a squad leader, you know? So I remind people of that. But here you see in 1816, we had the Treaty of Peace and Friendship. And do you know where that one was signed? It was signed in St. Louis. So can you imagine like a day like today, having to travel by horse down to St. Louis and back up? You know, just imagine all of what goes into each of these activities here. So I kind of try to paint that picture so you can just see the magnitude of every action that I'm just blurting out like it's nothing. There's lots and lots happening. This was the first of many treaties negotiated between our Ho-Chunk ancestors and the United States government. It was executed on June 3rd of 1816. Wisconsin Statute 7144. Winnebago had a village on the Wisconsin River at the time, and that village was led by Spoon Decora and Naga. In 1820, so that was the Treaty of Peace in 1816. Now we're 4 years later. In 1820, the continued removal of the Eastern Indian tribes was happening, and the federal government began to seriously look at the Wisconsin lands. So while we're here in Wisconsin dealing with this fur trade, right, and these missionaries coming in en masse, right, we have another situation, another problem. All the tribes that were on the East Coast that met the Mayflower, the Pilgrims, probably the earliest tribes to embrace English, Christianity, education, are now beginning to come westward. Many have walked here and have died along the way. Died of sickness, of harsh weather, died of old age for traveling, died of alcoholism and malnutrition, or just plain gave up and settled down, or disappeared along the way. But the ones who made it here to Wisconsin intact were the Stockbridge-Munsee, now known as the Stockbridge-Munsee, right? And the Oneida. We do know that history tells us in 1821, the Oneidas followed Eleazar Williams to Wisconsin. He was considered a half-breed, and I'm only using that because that's the historical term, but he was Oneida and he was French. He would tell people he was the lost Dauphin of France. He also was extremely Christianized, and whenever he said, everyone believed. So you have a sect of the tribe blindly following their Christian leader to Wisconsin. And they all settled in Oneida, which was not called Oneida. It was the land of the Menominee and of the Ho-Chunk, who then struck a treaty, and this is where we're going to get to here, of 1821, allowing to make room for these tribes seeking refuge. So no more different than immigrants coming in from another country with nowhere to live. Everyone's been killed off or they've died off. We ourselves are dealing with that as tribes in the Wisconsin territories. A small tract of land was provided for the Stockbridge-Munsee up by the Menominee Indian Reservation. It is still there today, also known as the Brotherton, right? And there is a land base in Oneida, so south of Green Bay, where the Oneida still lives today. And I have to make an anecdotal comment, and it's mainly me being sassy, because of all the tribes that are in Wisconsin now, we have 11. The one tribe that ended up with no reservation was the Ho-Chunk. So imagine having the tribe probably with the largest land base. If you look at Wisconsin, we had recognized title to the whole half of Wisconsin. So pretty much from Highway 29 down into Illinois, right, into Iowa. Shoot, we had enough sway and power all the way down to St. Louis. And we were the one tribe that had nothing. Nothing. But we gave up lands for others. And I think that's important because nobody teaches you that. You have to read these treaties and read these books. So we're coming up now. I left off at 1821. We're coming up to the Treaty of 1825 and 1827. And I'm going to start talking faster because I could talk all night, by the way. And in these treaties, they both preserved federal recognition to the Winnebago tribe by the United States. And it was well known that the Winnebagos mined lead and made ornaments as well. And we also made our own bullets out of the lead. So if you didn't know that, we were miners too. Probably miners before anyone else was miners around here. But we don't talk about that. So we did have mining activity and we made our own bullets. And then in 1825, we have the great treaty that happened at Fort Prairie du Chien. This treaty established the boundaries, and they were firm boundaries among all the tribes of the Great Lakes region. These treaty provisions were violated almost immediately upon execution of that treaty. They were violated in the terms that there were so many miners coming into Wisconsin that the terms of the treaty were completely ignored because these miners were rolling in and they were just setting up home base wherever they thought they could find what they were mining for. So it doesn't matter what the treaties say. It doesn't matter if this is your property. They're just going to go right in. And they were coming in such an influx, nothing really could be done about it. Remember, Wisconsin wasn't a state yet. This is 1825. We were still a territory. And in our territory, our claim extended from the southeast, which is the Rock River headquarters, for 40 minutes from the mouth of Illinois, west of the Mississippi River, north to the Black River, and to the upper Wisconsin River, but not across the Fox River. Okay, so kind of like the central part of Wisconsin. And during the negotiations of this treaty, the Treaty of 1825, the United States representatives advised the tribes that the United States would protect them in their boundary lines to prevent any bad people, right, from coming in and violating the terms of the treaty. It's quoted here that the United States government would protect the Ho-Chunk in their boundary lines, again, to prevent any bad people from crossing over to do mischief. And that is quoted in the BIA records of Appendix Tab 8, National Archives, microfilm T494. Despite these promises, encroachment by the miners continued, and confrontations between the Indians and the non-Indians were growing. These were daily. So keep in mind that this will continue on for the next 12 years. In 1827, in August of 1827, the Ho-Chunk nominated a warrior. His name was Redbird, to address the problem with the trespassing miners. You ever hear the story of Redbird? No? Okay, I'll take a break from this and give you that. In the Wisconsin State Capitol, if you go into the governor's office, there are portraits, right? And there's a portrait there, and it's of an Indian man in a white buckskin shirt with fringe, very handsome, and he's surrendering his arms to the military, and they're arresting him. And that is Chief Redbird. When I worked at the Wisconsin Historical Society for 3 years while I was in law school, I came across some letters written by white women about this Redbird. And I went to the Historical Society today and I couldn't find them, but I just need a little more time because he was so striking. He was extremely tall and extremely handsome and always well dressed. And he carried himself with the utmost integrity. And Redbird was asked to basically kind of dissipate the tensions. When he spoke, people listened. He was also a famed warrior. And we had a lot of upheaval. So bad that in one tense night, some young tribal members went out and killed a family that had come into their territory. And that family went out to go after those young men. And Redbird stopped them and said, "You can't do this. We can't live like this." And in protecting them, he surrendered himself. So in a sense, he sacrificed himself. And he was imprisoned at Fort Prairie du Chien. A short time later, he was found dead there. And the mystery remains. Did he commit suicide out of pride as a warrior? Or was he murdered? Or did he get sick? So those of you historians who want to research something, I think that would be an interesting story to learn about. And that's the story of Redbird. To this day, we still have members of the Redbird family residing in Wisconsin, up in the Black River Falls area. Sometimes I tell them about Redbird, and they said, "Why do I have to learn this way? How come no one told me about my ancestor?" And I said, "I understand your anger. I was there. I remember when I first learned Indian history. It wasn't even Ho-Chunk history. I was angry. Maybe that's just the first response, but it was a good response because I took that anger and I used it to keep studying all the time. So I had to channel it. But there is some anger when you don't know about yourself, right? When you don't know, why are we living in Endeavor? How did I end up here? What happened? And you're going to find out because you're hearing this. I feel like I'm painting this picture for you, and now you're seeing things come to life. There's a lot of activity in Wisconsin. There's a lot of hustle and bustle. There was a lot of war. There were a lot of people coming in. So in that picture, when you get to the Capitol one day, you'll look for that picture now. The issues that were raised during these treaty negotiations of 1821 back in August with Redbird there, at Lake Butimore, again, talked about our boundary lines. The Winnebago chief named Four Legs, Hujopka, he lived over by Oshkosh there. He had his own village. He says during the treaty negotiations, and these are documented, quote, so it's not me, this is Hujop talking, Father. When we say father, we're talking to the President of the United States or to the governor. There was no governor. Or even to the Indian agent. Okay, so when we say father, that's someone of the higher echelon. I have much to say. You have always told us to be still, to raise our children, provide for our families, and not to be afraid of your men. But I am afraid of your young men at the mines. There are a great many Americans on our land. They are working it without our permission, and I want you to tell our great father, that's the President of the United States, to stop it, to reach out his long arm and draw them back. See Appendix Tab 9, BIA Records, National Archives, Journal of Negotiations, the Treaty of Lake Butimore. The Treaty of 1827 was then signed at Lake Butimore, again established new territorial boundaries. The federal officials responded with the following. So this is what the feds are now saying to his statement documented at this treaty execution. Quote, we will send to your father your request about the people at the Rock River. Your great father will put an end to their encroachments and a wall around your land, so that none of our people shall go over. We do not intend that our people shall go on your land. We have foolish young men as well as you. When they do wrong, we will punish them. End of quote. August 15th, 1827. Now, I'll take a pause. Do you think they ever built a wall? Do you think anything was ever done to stop the encroachment? I don't even know how you could do that with just the geographical space. So in 1827, Chief Redbird continues to defend the Ho-Chunk areas, the land holdings that we have left, and the federal officials want him to be seized and surrendered. Thus, the Ho-Chunks keep their word. And at the request of the tribal leaders in September of 1827, it is said that Redbird and a number of his men, including his own son, surrendered themselves for the Ho-Chunk. While waiting his trial, he was later found dead in his cell at Fort Prairie du Chien. And that is the story of Redbird. Now, there was another treaty that came in 1828. That treaty was a treaty cession. Ho-Chunk sold the lead mining region to the government and agreed to, quote, not to molest or interfere, quote, with any more whites in the region. Around this time, growing tension began as America begins to say that they have an Indian problem because we occupy the lands that the settlers, the colonizers, and the miners want so badly, but no one knew what to do with us. At that time, we were being mass Christianized. We were taught to speak and read English. And then that leads us up to this treaty made in 1828 with the Winnebago, the Potawatomi, the Sac Fox, Ottawa, and Chippewas. Wisconsin Stat 7-315. When negotiating, the United States promised to pay $20,000 for the damages done by the trespassers. One of our Winnebago leaders or chiefs, known as White Crow, states, quote, "Father, if you had a piece of land and a stranger should take possession of it, would you like it? Would you expect payment for it?" Appendix, tab 10, BIA records, August 25th, 1828. And then in 1829, we have Andrew Jackson. Remember Andrew Jackson? So I come from Jackson County. I'm a supervisor there on the board. Do you know how hard it is to sit on a county that's named after the famed Indian killer? Imagine being Jewish and working for Hitler County. Just imagine that. When I ran for county board, all the local hochas, "What are you doing that for? Are you crazy?" I said, "We're not going to make a difference sitting and watching them make all the laws and regulations to control our headquarters and our land holdings. The only way we're going to make a difference is having someone in that room, and I'm willing to put myself out there right now." I don't know how long I'm going to last, but it is important because most people on Jackson County Board didn't know that until I told them. Again, history. That's why history is so important. In 1829, Andrew Jackson is elected as the 7th President of the United States of America and serves from March 4th, 1829 to March 4th, 1837. So we have 8 years under this president. He had the reputation for being an extremely fiery personality. And that leads us up to the Treaty of 1829. I always called it the terrible treaty. In that treaty, we gave up 2.5 million acres of land. So it was one of our largest land cessions. And I always wonder at that time, and this is what we were talking about, was let's set ourselves at the time when 1832 is coming. But now you're seeing what it's like in Wisconsin. It's not just here. We're Green Bay, all the way over to Minneapolis, into Illinois, parts of Indiana, down towards St. Louis, and over into Iowa. And one nation, Ho-Chunk, somehow is negotiating with the United States government. How is word getting to all these villages of our people? Well, it's not. There's no communication system. And just getting from, and I found this in the Waban book that I never noticed before, just getting from Green Bay to Oshkosh was 3 days in rapids in the water just to get there. And a lot of people died along the way because there were no roads. There was no infrastructure then. This is very, very tough times. So the communication's probably terrible at best. But in the Treaty of 1829, the Ho-Chunk cedes 2.5 million acres of land for $18,000 annually for a 30-year period. They also received 3,000 pounds of tobacco and 50 barrels of salt annually, in addition to $30,000 in gifts at the signing. The United States had their eye on our mineral rights. Little Elk, another chief, says that he is only a speaker. "I'm not a chief," and asked the treaty commissioners to listen to what the Winnebagos who are there to speak of that are the true masters of the land that the government wished to acquire. Appendix tab 11 BIA records. It is important to know that only certain clans can negotiate about land, not just any Ho-Chunk. Little Elk and Crow Killer, another chief, says, quote, "I'm only going to tell you how the tribes of our nation are divided. We are one nation, but those of you now see before you in front are of the earth, the landowners. They are out of the tribes. They are out of the tribes of the snakes and the other animals who come out of the earth. Those sitting behind them," so there's a whole bunch of tribal members here, okay? "Those sitting behind them are the tribes of the air. They do not belong to the earth, but are all of the same nation. I am of the tribes of the air, being the band of the Black Thunder." ID at 478. So they're trying to explain in Ho-Chunk through a translator that they're really not authorized, everyone in there, to be negotiating. Only certain people can, the ones who are sitting up front at this particular treaty signing, but all the ones that are of the air were in the back. Didn't matter. They made them put their X on those papers anyway. And you'll see that when you pull a treaty. So now we're at 1830. So I'm almost to the 1832. The Indian Removal Act of May 26 happens in 1830. Well, of course it's going to happen because who's the president, right? So now you're starting to put all this together. You kind of got to weave this quilt together here, and now everything's starting to make some sense. Lots and lots of different kinds of fabric. This was enacted during Andrew Jackson's tenure as President of the United States. It paved the way for the great Native American removals of the 19th century. In 1830, we were also experiencing overhunting. This overhunting almost obliterates Wisconsin's economy. And basically, our fur trade era was over. But the hunting just didn't end with the fur trade, right? There wasn't much food left. And you have tribes in Wisconsin being moved to their non-traditional territories into other warring tribes' lands. If you take a look at some of its history, the Menominees and the Ho-Chunks didn't get along at all. Matter of fact, the Menominees called the Ho-Chunks cannibals. You'll see it in all the old documents from the James Duane Doty papers. So you're going to see these references. I don't really think we were cannibals, but maybe there was this impression or this fear, but who knows. But I think that you see now this raging chaos, and that's the best way I can put it. Maybe I'm overinflating it, but I study history. This is what I'm reading. The Trail of Tears was happening, and many tribes were removed westward from their southeastern homelands so that cotton could be grown and land could be sold off to the influx of immigrants coming in from the east. However, Wisconsin tribes are really beginning to feel this impact now of all of these removals. Then we have these turn of events happen when the United States Supreme Court rules for Indian tribes. Totally unexpected surprise. In Worcester v. Georgia, where it affirmed that native nations were sovereign nations in which the laws of Georgia and other states can have no force. Now President Jackson has no intention of enforcing this rule. Came from the Supreme Court. He's not going to enforce it, and states that the Supreme Court decision would fall, quote, stillborn, end of quote, meaning dead on arrival. The southern states kept on with their land grabs. President Jackson was an Army general and had spent years leading brutal campaigns against the Creeks in Georgia, the Alabama and in Florida, and against the Seminoles in many campaigns that resulted in the transfer of thousands of acres of lands to all of the incoming immigrants. He carried out his crusade until he was no longer president. And now those tribes are all coming to Wisconsin. 1831. Old Day Corey, also known as Decorah, delivers an address on education to the Indian agent Kinsey. In regard to sending Indian children away to school. And in 1832, we have the Black Hawk War happening right here in our backyards, where the entire state of Wisconsin region is stressed as Black Hawk and his warriors go through Wisconsin, evading the military, with the tribes in Wisconsin secretly rooting for him and hiding him and his band. So they would go to these meetings and say, we're against Black Hawk, but then they'd be feeding him fresh horses and helping him along the way. The Treaty of 1832 comes on the heels of the Black Hawk Massacre of the Sauk, after Black Hawk was captured and surrendered by some Winnebago, and he was to be returned to his people in Iowa. The Treaty of 1832 executed on September 15th, 28317 Stat 370. The United States acquires from the Winnebago, reportedly 2,101,455 acres. See Winnebago Tribe v. U.S. 16 Indian Claims Commission, 81, 1965. The tribe was supposed to get a reservation in Minnesota and Iowa. You can see the Royce maps, Area 267, to find out the reservation. This is referred to as the neutral ground. The Winnebago were supposed to be paid an annuity of $10,000 per year for 27 years, and to provide a school with teachers for 27 years and miscellaneous goods. Now, this is important to note that the treaty commissioners, in their transmitting the treaty to Washington, that the land would be worth millions when they only paid a few $100,000. Appendix tab 12, September 22, 1832, to the Secretary of War Treaty Commissioners, Winfield Scott and Reynolds. So that's the document saying they knew they were taking the land for millions and paying only hundreds of thousands. And I think right there I'll take that break. So now I've laid the legal groundwork so you can see where we were at. This chair is probably going to drop this. I'll just set it here. Don't let me forget that. Okay. Frank Pomershine, Indian law professor. I studied under him out in University of New Mexico. Albuquerque, go Lobos, for a summer. Brilliant man. But he had one paragraph I liked. And it kind of goes with the earlier theme that I talked about of how important storytelling and history is, right? So remember, I'm a lawyer. So I always got to go back to some kind of legal narrative or construct. And here, I want to talk about what the plenary power doctrine is, because this is where people always say, how did this happen? How is all this power happening, these shifts of power? And the plenary power doctrine basically derives power kind of like from thin air, right? So let's go back to the early English constructs of government. And do you remember that statement? The king can do no harm, right? And the king can't do any harm. It's whatever the king says. And the queen, sometimes. But off with their heads, off with their heads. So they have this immense amount of power. And you have this new movement, right? Where power now isn't deriving out of thin air in America. Power is deriving from people through votes, right? So that's a big change, an entire change of philosophy. But do you know where the United States Constitution derives from?
Magna Carta?
No, but good choice. Have you ever heard of the Iroquois Confederacy? So they have this great law, predates America. And in this confederacy, you have the Oneida, right? The Mohawk, the Seneca, all these Iroquois tribes, 7 in all. Where do you think they got the idea to create the United States of America? They copied the great law. Somebody wrote a whole book on it. I have the book, I just didn't bring it. Otherwise, I'd pass it around for you to see. So sometimes we think that we come up in America with all these great ideas, but really we're just taking something that fits and making it ours. So if anyone tells you that the Constitution is based on a Christian nation, it is not. If anyone tells you that the notion of the government acting as one was something that was thought up by the framers of the Constitution, it was not. That is documented. And our history books don't teach us this. But now you know, and you can do your own research because somebody published a book. And in that book is the great law of the Oneida and almost page by page the Constitution copying it. I'm going to quote Frank here, and he says, "Stories and narratives are powerful means for destroying a mindset. The bundle of presuppositions, received wisdom, and shared understanding against a background in which legal and political discourse is taking place is happening all over America. We must look to our tribal courts in order to spend a considerable amount of time to draft and prepare tribes and tribal constitutions to the provisions that might be claimed to limit our tribal court jurisdictions." What he's trying to say is, if we don't write our own history and our own laws and our own constitution, and someone else is writing it for us, it's not going to help us any. Okay? So, here we are, 1832 now. The 440 families, all documented. I looked over some of the names on the slides that you have. I wish we had a projector. We could probably put those names up. I don't think that was probably all of the families, just the families that could actually get here to be documented, right? And in those annuities, we, as the Ho-Chunk people, use those documents to verify if someone is Ho-Chunk or not. My concern is, and we use annuity rolls. It's, if you look at the Ho-Chunk Constitution, it's right in like the first or second page. There are base rolls right up to like 1905. So if you can't document your ancestry to one of those names on there, you cannot be enrolled. But how many families never got to Portage, right? I mean, I was driving the terrain, and I don't know if it's because I have a land use background, but from Madison to here, and I was looking at all this marshy territory. And I was thinking, how did they get through this area? They couldn't have. They probably had to go a different way. No, they probably had to go a different way. They had to use this little canal right here. Like, I couldn't understand how the travel could occur with families and carts and horses, and maybe not horses, maybe nothing. But where did they walk? How do you cross the river? So all of this is playing in mind. And we have these 440 families. So we ourselves, by adopting the annuity rolls as the teller of who's going to be a Ho-Chunk or not, may have really cheated ourselves out of an entire population of those who survived and continue to survive without even knowing anymore. Because why? Because your history is erased from you, right? So we probably, and this is me and this is a legal and educated guest of someone who is obsessed with history, I bet you we were 2 times or 3 times that amount in our population numbers. I think we were so massive that we could not be counted. And we were so fluid with the seasons. It's true. Her story is absolutely true. We moved with the weather. So as you read Waban and you're going through Wisconsin, how many times did John Kinsey and his wife, Juliet, get to a village and it's completely empty because they went here to do cranberries and they went here to do something else. But history didn't change, because even now that we use digital census numbers of our tribal members, because we can tell you where they're all living. We used to be able to do it quarterly, because in order to get your tribal per capita, you had to say where you lived and get it notarized and evidence your residency. We could digitally show the movement of our people, because we're engaged in the tourism industry. So in the summer, our boom tourism is in the Wisconsin Dells. So you'll see a lot of tribal members migrate down to the Wisconsin Dells area. We just finished cranberry seasons. You'd see a lot of them migrate back up to do the cranberries, all in the central Wisconsin Rapids to Black River Falls region. So we still do that yet today. We're still moving around. We're not in one area. And maybe that's why we didn't end up with a reservation, because you couldn't put us all in one spot. Which brings me to the next. These are more just philosophical ideas that I've adopted in my research, but I'm not a traditionalist in the sense of theory. I consider myself a futurist. Which is funny, because I have a twin brother, and he's an absolute traditionalist. He eats traditional foods every day. He tans hides with brains probably every other day. He harvests wild rice. He makes moccasins. He is a traditionalist. And then here's me reading Revolutionary Wealth by Elvin and Heidi Toffler. I'm on like their 6th version now. After reading some of their other earlier books, because they were futurists. They weren't predictions, they weren't psychics, they were looking at economy and how fast time changes an area. And the main theme of all their books is if an area develops too fast in information, it can cause a serious and massive disruption to the brains of people. And they use the industrial, right, revolution as their example, where we had mass canneries, and we were making ammunition en masse, we were making clothing en masse. And how did that new economy affect people? Well, it took women out of homes, because women began to work because men were off to war, right? Children began to work. So I think of how does all this work by these futurists affect, the macro level of Wisconsin and America. But I also think of the microcosms of how it affects us, because rapid change happened to our people. In a very short time, in 200 years, we went from not speaking any English, or really a one homogeneous language, to being able to read and write, right? And this is where I kind of do a little feminist dedication, because the last of our people to stop wearing the dress, to not cut their hair, and to only speak Ho-Chunk were the women, the mothers. And to this day, the women still hold the family together. So in all the early pictures that you're going to see of all of these important dates and times, you'll see our men with, most of them with short hair. They're dressed kind of colonialized, maybe moccasins, maybe a beaded pipe bag or something. But the women you'll still see in their blankets and shawls, in their hair tied, the one hair tie in the back, the pachgeochko and their pachge, the earrings, the traditional earrings from the trade. So there's a little bit of a shout out I got to give to women for holding the families together and continuing to teach the language in the households. Anyway, we were talking about what was it like in 1832, and I can envision it with this legal sense, I can envision it with this economical sense, but a good way to cement it is just to quote like a couple of footnotes by Juliet Kinsey. And I found her footnotes to be probably the most exciting part of her book. Anyone know the Green Bay area pretty well? Nobody? There's a lot of names in here. So when you go through a book like this, you're going to hear about the Langlades, the Champlains. You're going to hear about the La Follettes. You're going to hear about the Douglases, the Rollettes, the Paquettes, Pierre Paquette, I can get to him in a minute. But it was kind of interesting to, hear all these names. Here's one. James Duane Doty was appointed in 1823 as the United States Judge for the part of Michigan west of Lake Michigan. Later, he was the territorial governor of Wisconsin between 1841 and 1844. A tablet marks the site of his home opposite of Camp Smith in Wisconsin. The northern portion of the modern city of Green Bay was also platted in 1829 by Daniel Whitney and named Navarino for the Greek town where a recent battle had occurred. So when you go up there, I think you can go skiing in Navarino Hill, by the way. So Wisconsin was a territory and became a state in 1848. That's the fourth grade thing you learn, right? The rhyme. Wisconsin became a state in 1848. But from 1832 to 1848, we were in a stasis. And in the stasis, you're going to see the Ho-Chunk people fight to remain in what little land holdings they have in Wisconsin. Because we had this Black Hawk War happening. And remember I told you the tribes were aiding Black Hawk on the side, from what I know. But this Black Hawk War is something huge. I don't think someone can even write enough about it. We had the massacre at Bad Axe, right? You read this, you think you've read it all. But adding to that, you have the Battle of Wisconsin Heights all happening. This is chaos, absolute chaos. And I want to pass these books around because there are kind of some really neat illustrations in here. So you can kind of still get an idea of who I'm talking about and what's all happening in around 1832. Here you go. And then this one, you can go that way, okay? And to kind of cement, I get so excited I could probably stand up by at this point. I feel like I'm born again preaching over here. But I love this stuff. Where did I have this? Hold on. I should have marked this. Okay. So a couple things about Black Hawk that I didn't know. It all began at about this spot on April 5th, 1832, when Black Hawk, a 65-year-old Sauk warrior, 65 years old, and he's flying through Wisconsin in a war. That's a big deal. Led his band east across the Mississippi River, contrary to an agreement he had signed with the previous summer to stay away from the Sinisippi, Rock River, the old Sauk country. He had since decided that life in the new Sauk and the Meskwaki lands in Iowa was unbearable. Remember, the Meskwakis are here too. And why they're never recognized as a Wisconsin tribe when they clearly have a footprint in Wisconsin is interesting. So people oftentimes don't know that we always say the Sac and Fox, right? So the Fox, they're all the same now, but at one point in time, they were two separate tribes. So let's just give you a day in the life of this war. In addition to this, Napope, a Sauk civil chief and ally of Black Hawks within the tribe, brought news that the British were sympathetic to his dilemma. They might be of assistance if the Americans attacked. Wabokishik, or White Cloud, the Ho-Chunk prophet, had also promised the assistance of his band as well, as the other tribes who now found themselves threatened by white expansion, among them the Kickapoo, the Potawatomi, and the Ho-Chunk. Black Hawk was now determined to lead his people back into their ancestral homelands at Saukenuk. There they would plant their corn in the summer, as they always had for eons and generations. The United States government and the numerous settlers in the area were not the only opposition to Black Hawk's decision. Indeed, the matter threatened to split the Sauk and the Meskwaki people under the leadership of Keokuk, the civil chief, who Black Hawk despised for his policies of appeasing with the whites. The majority of the tribes had decided to stay on their new lands. However, Black Hawk had distinguished reputation among the two tribes as a great warrior and still enjoyed a considerable amount of influence over many of his people. Although not a civil chief, he was able to recruit as many as 2,000 Sac and Fox, including 500 warriors, to return to Illinois with him for war. Soon after their arrival on the east bank of the Mississippi, Black Hawk's band began to head north to Saukenuk. And on the way, the prophet, that's the Ho-Chunk, met with the band and informed Black Hawk that there was now a party of soldiers on the way to Fort Armstrong in Rock Island, and it was likely that if they went to Saukenuk, a few miles ahead, they would be attacked and probably be defeated. So, some of the earlier points, and you can pass this around, that I had made is all the tribes didn't just get along and all agree at once. They had their own inner wars within the tribe and within the different regions. So, it's chaos, again. It is chaos. I was going to pass this around so you can kind of see that too.
You know, the one thing I want to share with you, the Battle of Bad Axe, when I was a little girl, my parents always told me that was red with blood.
Oh, they did.
From women and children.
It was.
Yes.
There was one wagon, and it was full of 12 white women and children, and they were all axed to death, literally axed to death. And the general said, well, if they're killing our women and children, we're going to kill theirs. And he took off like a crazy man, but his horse got shot, and he survived, probably because his horse got shot. But later on, the Indian agent said, well, your group killed their women and children. That's why they killed your women and children. Now you're going back to kill their women and children. And it's that whole territorial law, right? It's the eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So when you go to the Wisconsin State Capitol and you ever go up into the Wisconsin Supreme Court, there's a mural up there. And that evidences the territorial law at the time is, all right, you get me, I get you. And that was the law until laws were actually put into place with due process. And speaking of laws, as tribes emerged with their government, we created our own courts. And in that vein of thought, although the courts are based on Western laws, we still have some tribal traditional laws that are really interesting, that, at least at Ho-Chunk. And we still exert jurisdiction over those, where we can exert jurisdiction, I should say. And that's important to us. So one time when I first graduated law school, I was asked to write a dog ordinance because there's this amount of pit bulls that people were bringing into the mission lands. And they run loose because Ho-Chunks don't believe you should tie up your dogs. They're your guardians. They're part of the community. So anyway, we had these pit bulls, and not only were they attacking people, but they were also attacking each other as they began to pack up. So the leaders were like, hey, write a dog ordinance. So I wrote the dog ordinance, and they passed it. And a 98-year-old elder chewed me out really bad at the area meeting. Because how dare I take our brothers and sisters, these dogs, and put them in pens, and I really learned a quick lesson because I was just looking at other ordinances from other governments and applying it to us. So we really curve back, and unless the dog can prove it's a vicious dog, it's allowed to have its reign of freedom. And now since then they've curved it a little bit more. They do have the leashes on there, but they didn't have it as harsh as I originally started. So I learned a good lesson. And why is that important? Because our laws are going to apply to our culture and our values, right? When someone passed away, we don't probate for at least 4 years as a culture. But the reality is we need to probate immediately because that house is going to become a dilapidated, right? Or the pipes are going to freeze or something else is going to happen. So as I close out my speech, I talked about how important it was that we learn our history, because what happens if we don't learn from it, right? It repeats itself. And in a sense, will it repeat itself now? Well, not maybe on the holistic level of, the entire string of history that you were just really thrown at you in a very short amount of time. But it does make you think about the bigger issue, and that is, where do we go from here? What's our future going to look like? We know what happened in the past. Where did these families go? Would someone be willing to upload this into genealogy.com just out of curiosity, see how many families have generated since then? I don't know, but those are all kind of fun questions, and a lot of the traditionalist Ho-Chunks would say, no, we don't want anyone to know anything more about us. They got enough already, right? So there's this kind of this institutional review mentality of we'll keep what we have to ourselves. And then you have people like me who are like, why not find out what happens? Because maybe if I get this data, maybe I know where we're going. And that's kind of where I wanted to end, because we still are here today. And we are a major part of the Wisconsin economy today. And not just Ho-Chunk, but all the tribes. But I don't think we've asserted our presence enough. Because every time you go to a wayside, I think there should be markers there with historical things. But not just there. Every time you go to a school, there should be one. And every time you go to a zoo, or even a church, because churches are intrinsically tied to our history. I can't believe how much historical documentation I get from the Mormons and the Episcopalians and the Catholic Church and the United Church of Christ Mission Church up in Black River Falls. So there's all this information, and somehow we still survived, even with all of this happening and outbreaks. So this is a book by this lady named Penny Kelly. It's a book called Robes, a book of coming changes. And a girlfriend of mine went to Harvard, and I was telling her how I was really getting disgusted with myself and my life, because I did what I was taught to do. And I was that good kid in school, the top kid in the high school. I went straight to college. I got those degrees. I went right into law school, and I got those degrees. And now I'm a lawyer for my tribe on the front lines and we're winning our cases. But I was coming home and I just wasn't happy. And I was like, gosh, I built a brand new house on land that I bought for the tribe as their real estate attorney. And we moved it in a trust so no one could ever take it again. And I built the first Section 184 Indian home loan. And I'm living in my dream log home and I'm not happy. What is this madness? What the heck just happened here? I did everything right. I didn't get married. I didn't have kids right away. I waited and all that. I foster parented. And she was listening to me and she goes, you remind me of this book I once read from a girlfriend. I said, what book is that? And she goes, I read this book called The Book of Robes by Penny Kelly. And everything you say kind of comports with that book. You should really read that book. And she goes on about her day, and I'm thinking, oh, I wonder if I should pick up that book. So I ordered it, and I got the book. She left. She only came to visit. And I finished the book, and I said, holy cats, in one generation, in my generation, and this was on me, I almost killed our entire survival. My children and my foster children never gardened. They didn't hunt. They weren't sewing. They weren't speaking the language. I almost taught them an entire new life where I grew up sewing. My brothers hunted, and we gardened every day. We dried corn in the fall. And so did my grandma and her grandma and her grandma, and keep going all the way back. And there I was. I thought I was the product that my people wanted me to be. And with all that education, with all that knowledge, I almost killed the very thing that we had sophisticated for thousands of years. So I cut off the internet. We bought a farm. We planted 11 acres of Indian corn. I've always had horses, so I turned it into a horse ranch, a business. We grow our own food. We grow our own chickens, our own eggs. We have our beef cow. Yeah, I had to go back because I became something that's why I was so unhappy. Because I was a survivor and I was glad to have this new life, but I almost didn't give that to my children. So I remind a lot of other Ho-Chunks, it's real easy to step into another world, even though I'm immersed in my people. I grew up on a reservation in Oneida. So this is what my ending's going to be. This one paragraph that this girl wrote. Until that moment, I did not realize how much my identity and security was tied up with the concepts of a nation, of a country, or even a sense of place. I had never considered myself to be particularly patriotic, and thus the power of my identification with this nation in this place rocked me to the core. So sitting in my truck in the middle of downtown Mount Clemens, Michigan, and for me, Black River Falls, Wisconsin, I was so shocked I could not even open the door and step out of my truck to begin my errands. Instead, I looked around at the physical structures of a shopping center and grocery carts and a bank building and a parking lot, wanting them to be as familiar and as serenely transparent to the structures of my thoughts as they would have only been a few moments before. But somehow, with highways and houses and office buildings and cafes and schools and stoplights and even a river and a bridge, allowed me to drive over that river without being conscious. That water was flowing. All of this formed a backdrop against my perception, and it followed its usual and rutted routines. These structures stood for the United States and the United States' way of life. They symbolized us, that they were us. And again, I thought, are these the things the United States are, or are they just buildings and lands and streets and stoplights to which we apply our attitudes and perceptions? As I stared helplessly out of the once familiar urban landscape, I suddenly understood the levels that I had never touched before of my own identity. And that's what happened to me. I realized that I became something else and lost something. So I quick regained myself and I balanced. And it wasn't easy. It's still not easy today. But I thought I'd share all of this history with you so you can see where we're at today. Now we're a tribe, 7,400 strong. We do have 6 casinos, all gaming sites, owned and operated by the tribe, not a outside corporation or management agency. We have 2 mega land tracts that we fought for. One called the Kickapoo Valley Reserve, 1,200 acres of land that were excess federal property that we put a bid in for, and we beat everybody else. And they were really mad at us, particularly the state of Wisconsin at the time. But we got a beautiful piece of property that we manage now as basically a large nature's outdoor classroom. And then the other piece of property we put a bid in on excess property was the Badger Army ammunition plant. And we were able to gain, I want to say 1,400 acres there. Maybe I'm off a little bit. And we were able to get what I would dub the amoeba, because there was this map. And I said, which one's you're the geologist and the biologist. Show me which area we want, because I'm going to get this application in. The day they open it up, we're going to already be done. So we mapped, and it looked like a big amoeba. And I had them do the legal descriptions, the surveyors, and so we put it in our bid. We slapped it in there, and we won the amoeba. So the cleanest part, the most pristine part of the Badger ammunition plant, we have there. We've done significant repatriation on site. I don't think it's still fully ready for development, but we do have a Little Eagle Arts Foundation occurring there now, so we have some commercial activity going there. And I did hear that there may be the possibilities of maybe a possible hemp drying facility, because it'd be all above ground and you don't need to access the water. It's just a drying place or a base, and it has security that's basically established from the prior activity that the land was used for. So it's really exciting to hear, where we're at now. Are we where we want to be? I don't know yet. I don't think I'm ever satisfied. I might be one of those people where I want more for everybody, and I'm going to keep fighting for it. But are we in a good place? I think we are. Because by not having a reservation, people like me can run for county board. And we have a say, we have a voice somewhere. And we just had a tribal member who is also a legislator for the tribe, also run for Sauk County Board, and she just finished her term, Kristen White Eagle. So we have these other opportunities, because we don't live on Indian land, to engage in our communities and to be a part of the community. And I firmly believe we're going to be here forever. I really do. So thank you for all of your time and attention. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
I just want to share with you. I was a Girl Scout counselor with Cheryl Thundercloud. I don't know if you know her, but she's from Black River Falls.
Shelley or Cheryl?
She went by Cheryl, but we called her Shelley sometimes.
Okay.
My name was Bugs, and we would go on these canoe trips down the Black River. And we would we would have our campfire, the girls would make their supper. And then she would sit there and say, now, what do you know about Indian history? And she would talk about the whole land and being part of the land, and where did the scalping come from? Where did you learn all this stuff? And she would dispel those myths on, like, these were 7th and 8th graders that we were talking to. So that was a pretty neat thing. She was with the Black River Falls High School uprising they had there at one time.
Okay. Might have been before my time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I was at a horse show, and they must have had horses because they came from Black River Falls, and I was an official there.
Oh, okay.
And just here for a fun show. And I said, they came with the Thundercloud, and they said, yeah, that's my aunt. And so it was kind of interesting to see that circle.
Yeah, come round. Yep.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
And a lot of Thunderclouds are still riders today. So that'd be Zach Thundercloud's daughter, and they ride at our farm. Yeah. Well, hopefully, maybe, the spirits within each of you are kind of awakened to all of our history. And I'm just excited to see what the future will bring, because we are starting to access technology and apply it to some of our movements. Like, for me, I'd like to see a digital animation of each treaty movement. I mean, we've seen all the maps. Matter of fact, I stopped at the State Historical Site this morning because I thought it was important that I plant my hands on an actual treaty, since I hadn't touched one in about 25 years when I graduated law school, just to get that energy back, because my ancestors touched that. That's what I wanted. So I did that today, and the young man working there said, "How do you know this?" I said, "Oh, I worked here. I did what you did, but I did it for 3 years." So it was kind of neat, you know. Anyway, I learned so much in even just today with technology, where I knew exactly where things were, so I filled out the index cards. He goes, "Oh, we don't do that anymore. Everything's all digital." I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I'm starting to feel old all of a sudden." So I said, "I know this is right here. It goes on this shelf over here," and he brought it back right away. So it was kind of like a good memory for me as well. And that's a good place if you ever have time to go to that historical society and see some of them documents, because once you touch them, I think you appreciate so much that went into the execution of them. Now, I did see Paquette Park here driving through, and I don't know if I like Pierre Paquette yet. So Pierre Paquette was half French and half Ho-Chunk, and he was a translator, right? So I don't know.
Was right in the trees right
Oh, yes. So I didn't know if he's probably going to get mad at me if he could hear me, but I didn't know if I could trust him or not, because he ended up with some good land holdings, and he actually had a really nice house at the time. So I always wonder, but you'll see on these treaties, in these treaty books, Mark Dietrich has a really good book. Pierre Paquette said this. And here's an example of how easy it is to make one mistake. In one of our removals, we agreed to 8 years to be removed, right? And the treaty actually said 8 months. So in the middle of a ceremony, the military came in and removed everyone. They said, "No, we have 8 years." They said it was 8 months. So it's really easy, one word, how everything can change. And one other, I guess this would be fun if someone would like to collaborate. I would like to do this. This is one of I put this on my wish list here. I don't want to say bucket list, but a wish list. And that is to retrace the removals and literally just get a big bus, load it with as many historians as we can, and kind of follow the removal route just to kind of get an idea of the landscape. And we probably will come across some mass burials, right? Because we had some cholera outbreak at one point in time. We had boxcar of tribal members freeze to death in the cold. They were mass buried, and all the way to Nebraska and then back. So you could stop by Blue Earth in Minnesota, and you can just see these families and family names. I remember I always open a phone book along the way to Nebraska, because you can still see Ho-Chunk names in their phone books, even though they don't know they're Ho-Chunk anymore, some of them. So that's kind of neat to see.
Amazing how much all these families have gone through to still be here. I mean, the one thing, until you look at history, you don't understand why it's special to have, Ho-Chunk families in Wisconsin until you realize what they went through to, still be here.
And even not just Ho-Chunk. Look at I have a sister-in-law who was told she was Italian, the south part of Italian, Sicilian, her whole life. She's a Youper, And finally one day she goes, "My cousin told me at my wedding that we actually aren't Sicilian, that we're Indians." I'm like, "Well, what tribe?" She goes, "I think Chippewa." And so you don't want to say Cherokee, because everyone would always say they're Cherokee. But I was like, "Well, let's look into that when we have time." So I said, she goes, "Well, where do I start?" I go, "Well, you got to ask your mom and dad or your grandparents." So she went back to her mom and said, "Mom, so-and-so said that we're part Indian. Is that true?" And her mom goes, "Yes." "Really? How come you didn't tell me? I'm 25 years old." "Well, you never asked." "Well, why don't we tell anyone?" And well, let me tell you why. Grandma couldn't tell anyone she was Indian, or they'd take her away. And so we were always told never tell anyone we were Indian, we were Sicilian. And that's something I didn't even touch on. And that was the taking of Indian children and putting them in boarding schools, because that would be a whole nother night. Mm-hmm. And that one, I think you would really want to prepare yourself for, to hear those stories, because it is so hard to hear. But those stories shaped our history too. And this is why so many of our young people don't want to go away to college. They don't want to move away from home, because their grandparents were taken to these Indian schools and they were sexually abused. They were beaten down. Even the Christian, it didn't matter what sect of the Christian school it was, and they survived. How they survived, I don't know. But that's where we come from. So they said every time you talk to an Indian person, just so you know, they all are survivors of an Indian boarding school because you cannot dilute the survivors. So that's a reality. And then the other reality is how many people don't use healthcare facilities. Why do Native people not use healthcare facilities? Well, a perfect example is you have experiments happening on people, right? So in the 1970s, my mother's era, her cousins and friends were all forced sterilized. They went to the Indian Health Service hospital, and you can Google all this. You don't have to believe me if you don't want. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Indian Health Service practiced forced sterilization on our people. Just in the 70s. So I was born in 72, so you have an example of why does anyone not want to go? They don't want to give up their DNA. They don't want to research this because of all of this. And then the final trauma that I always say is the same one that I shared with you earlier, and that's the trauma of a government. Every treaty that I read to you was broken. And not broken slowly. They are broken from the minute they were struck. So there's just great distaste for government. Even our own tribal government, there's a great distaste for. So what's the easy answer? I don't have an easy answer. But it is compelling because I always believed this. The Indian tribes were the first peoples to be experimented on many levels. So let's just use rations, right? The treaties and rations given out. You control the whole population of people. The story I told you about my own self of losing thousands of years of all of that, you're going to see in these history books right here. Because you're going to see families living right out here in these yards because they didn't have anywhere to go. And they don't know how to farm anymore. A lot of them were addicted to alcohol. They're just waiting for that annuity to get the alcohol. The food. There was foods that they never had before that they're forced to cook with. A piece of fat, right? Bacon fat, flour. I thought it would be neat to go shopping and get some of the things of those annuities so you can kind of see. But you kind of already know what they are, and it was really raining out. But it's really good to kind of really put together that. And it didn't all come in one lump sum like Amazon.com or a trip to Walmart. You had to wait for that stuff to come down the river. So maybe that time there was some pork. Maybe another time there was some sugar or some salt. Another time there'd be some flour or some cotton, calico. It never just all happened at once. And what happened was our people began to just wait for those shipments to come in. And they called it inventory. They did it on every Sunday. It's captured in this Waban book here. Every Sunday they wait to see what came in and how they could inventory it, and who was going to get that cloth and who was going to get those blankets and who was going to get this. And it basically is the people raised to be completely dependent on the community, the Indian agent, or the government. And we almost lost everything, but we survived. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you again. I hope everyone has a safe trip.
A lot of food for thought.
Yeah, lots of food, and I'd love to do this again. If you don't have to listen to me talk. I actually enjoy more listening to other people talk because I learn from everybody else. So maybe we can do this again.
You come back again.
Yeah, we should. In the wintertime is when we can really talk.